In My Hero Academia, Izuku was born quirkless, but what if he wasn't? What if he was born with the same exceptional gift that everyone else seems to have? How would he fare over the course of the story? In today's video, I'm going to break down each arc and how the events would change, starting with the entrance exam.
Editing Xehther here. So the original version of this video got pretty much terminated and YouTube ended up cucking me, but it's all good. This is a re-uploaded version. I changed the editing style this time around so that it wouldn't happen. And yeah, if you guys could just do me a favor and, you know, leave a like and like watch twice or something like that, it would be very, very, very much so appreciated. That said, enjoy.
Immediately in the first arc of the story, everything changes. Izuku's life is so much easier. This time around, he's even friends with Katsuki Bakugo from the very beginning. He's confident and he's powerful, considering that he would train with Bakugo, and not only would that mean that Deku is stronger, but that would also mean that Bakugo's stronger, because he had a rival early on, and because of that, Bakugo is not half as conceited as he would be otherwise. The other part that would definitely change would be the written exam would be passed with a B, slightly under what it was in the original due to the fact that this time around Izuku would focus a little more in terms of his physical aspect and strength. When it comes to the robot portion of the entrance exam, Izuku's life would be so easy. I mean, he would go on to mollywop these robots, getting a total of 140 robot points using his rage quirk. Now this is where I need to explain to you guys what exactly this rage quirk is, because it's a quirk that I personally have thought of, and it essentially works like this. Izuku's anger is directly linked to his power output. The more angrier he gets, the more powerful he gets. Not only does his anger allow him to have manifestable strength, but it also gives him access to energy like whips like Black Whip, energy beams, as well as insane super strength, speed, and durability, which his rage quirk will be giving him access to. It's almost like he was a mini Hulk. This would lead Izuku to getting an insane 140 robot points using his rage quirk. And not only that, but when the zero pointer itself would come out, he would end up getting an additional 50 points by saving Uraraka. In the original, he would have saved her due to his heroic heart, but this time around, he saves her because he just is delighted to take on the challenge of the zero pointer. And so, he would end up passing and getting accepted into UA High. Next, we got the Quirk apprehension arc. Essentially just a rundown of their quirks in the section in which Aizawa tests everybody. For the beginning of how this arc would immediately begin to change, Izuku would get an insane score during this test. He would go on to obliterate it, getting amazing scores. For the 50-meter dash, he gets 2.5 seconds. In the grip strain test, he destroys it. In the long jump, he clears the box like everyone else basically did. During the side steps, he does, well, kind of like Saitama, but way less OP, of course. During the ball throw, he ends up getting 2,000 meters, and for the 3 remaining tests, he does incredibly well. And then, when it comes to how his scores would have ended up totaling, because he ended up getting great scores overall and everything, he ends up actually getting first place this time around. Bakugo going on to get third place because his quirk wasn't really too helpful in some of the sections of the exam. Now jumping into the battle trial arc, however, this is where we're going to be getting to see the 2v2 battles. And for this specific occasion, I used a random wheel generator to generate the name that is going to be the teammate for Izuku this time around. And who I got was Ida. And his enemies consist of Shoji, aka Dupli-Arm, and Aoyama, aka Captain Spark. And when it comes to this battle, I don't even think that a lot of you guys need me to break this down. Deku would completely obliterate them each using nothing but his own super strength, not even having to muster up that much anger. He simply pulls up on Shoji, one taps him, Sparkles will try to shoot a laser beam at him, however Ida would come in the way and reciprocal burst kick Sparkles straight in the stomach, sending him flying, leading Sparkles to pass out completely, and for them both to be told that they have won their battle trial exam. Next up, we got the USJ arc. And this is where events would finally now begin to change. We're now getting into serious territory. When Deku would be teleported by Kurogiri this time around, he would be very well equipped to handle the situation. And so immediately, just like he would in canon, he would lunge up into the air before then throwing a punch to the water screaming, "Die!" Just like Bakugo would, eventually leading all the villains to get vortexed away, and then Froppy would come in and save him, herself, and Mineta. After this, immediately Izuku, upon seeing Aizawa facing off against all these villains, would not simply stay there and watch. I definitely could see this version of Izuku lunging in and immediately getting to work, tag teaming a bunch of villains with Aizawa. However, just like in canon, definitely Shigaraki would decide to ultimately unleash the Nomu, and this would lead Izuku and Aizawa to both have to tag team the Nomu. Aizawa using his quirk to pretty much get rid of the Nomu's regeneration, and Izuku trying to hold off the Nomu as much as he can. He's taking damage, and eventually the more he takes, the angrier he gets. Eventually, he leads him to a point where himself and the Nomu would finally begin getting on equal footing, worrying Shigaraki, causing him to tell Kurogiri to pretty much intervene in the fight and make sure that the Nomu wins. However, just as Kurogiri was about to do that, Bakugo would come flying in using explosions and would set one off right in front of Kurogiri's face, causing Kurogiri to get completely taken out of the course of the battlefield, and Bakugo and Izuku would tag team the Nomu alongside with Aizawa, ultimately destroying it completely, and them being put on the news as the two kids responsible for essentially helping out a ton with the heroes in terms of the raid on the USJ. However, ladies and gentlemen, now we have the UA Sports Festival arc, where nowadays Izuku goes on to do very well, because of the fact that even a quirkless Izuku with One For All, of course, who barely even knew how to use it, was able to get very far. I think that an Izuku with a quirk that he is very much so accustomed to, and kind of similar to One For All in terms of the power output, then we could definitely say that Izuku would do very well. In terms of the race, Izuku would do incredible, actually getting number 1 in first place in that aspect. For the cavalry battle, because this time around himself and Bakugo are actually friends and they know that they're probably going to get to fight in the 1v1 battles, they decide to team up for the headband portion, aka the cavalry battle, and they would end up passing that with ease. Not even Todoroki was able to stand a chance against them. And this ultimately just leads for all the rest of the teams that ended up passing in the original to pass. This time around, when Izuku has the 1v1 battles and he goes up against Shinso, I'm guessing a lot of you probably thought that he was going to get captured because of his general nature that he's going to be having this time around, of not exactly being the same kind-hearted Deku, but actually having more of a mix of a cocky and arrogant, aka Bakugo kind of persona that just kind of is more laid back in a sense, if I do say so myself. Deku this time around, upon the second that he hears insults coming from Shinso, Izuku would immediately get angry at that, and he would smirk, not even using any words to pretty much try to rebuttal Shinso, instead deciding to let his hands do the talking. And so the second that Izuku would run towards Shinso, Shinso would attempt to parry and block, but it would do nothing, and Deku would punch the forearm of Shinso, sending him hurtling straight out of the arena. Next would be Izuku's fated battle against Shoto Todoroki, where I'm sure that this battle specifically, a lot of you guys would probably want my take on this. Now, normally, if Deku just had nothing but sheer strength, I probably wouldn't say that he would be able to do very good. However, this would actually be a very interesting battle. Rageful Deku versus calm and composed Todoroki? Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting one. The battle would immediately start with Todoroki shooting a geyser of ice at Deku. However, Deku, using his rage quirk, would shoot an energy ball straight at the direction of the ice, and he would completely melt through it, causing Todoroki to have to jump out of the way and dodge the attack. However, Izuku, due to the fact that he has that opening in the ice, would just continue shooting beams, not letting Todoroki create space between them, and ultimately using his energy like whips, would go on to grab a hold of Todoroki and snatch him towards his direction. And Todoroki, because he's not able to use his fire because of the fact that he never has the talk with Izuku, Todoroki tries his absolute best to use his ice quirk to catch Izuku off guard, ultimately freezing him in place, and Todoroki barely avoiding being sent completely out of the ring. This would lead Izuku to be frozen and the match to essentially be left to be called by the referee. However, this would be when Izuku would end up melting this ice and he would break free from it, his eyes shining a vibrant red. Todoroki being completely taken aback, Izuku would speed blitz him and punch him. Even with Todoroki putting a barrier of ice to avoid the blow, Izuku would tear right through it and send Todoroki flying out of the arena, causing Endeavor to let out a war cry in the stage and Izuku to then move on to his next opponent. And yes, I know I said opponent. Anyways though, Izuku would now go on to face off against Bakugo, and this would be a very interesting fight. if Bakugo had a different quirk, because he doesn't. Due to the fact that Deku and Bakugo have always been fighting together, Bakugo kind of knows the result of what would happen right now, and so he would simply tell Izuku to go all out and not to hold back even a bit. He wants the whole world to watch Izuku lose at his best. Deku would begin laughing, saying, "You do realize that our record is not exactly in your favor, right, Katsuki?" And Bakugo would say, "Whatever," as he would assume his battle stance, and immediately the ref would say, "Hajime," leading both fighters to immediately run to their positions, and Bakugo would shoot up into the sky, shooting AP shot after AP shot. Izuku would say, "Fine, that's how you want to play it?" And he would shoot energy beams at Bakugo easily dodging them in the air. And Izuku would then begin to get tired of this, restless, using one of his energy whips to shoot it at Bakugo's leg and drag him right back down to the earth. However, Bakugo was expecting this, and so he spun and let this energy whip drag him and shot a full power explosion at Deku's face. Deku would then be sent flying back, almost sent off of the ring, but Izuku, through anger alone, would be able to manage to get right back up and rush back at Bakugo, leading both fighters to land blow after blow after blow on each other. However, as Bakugo would begin getting tired and he would begin to lose his stamina, Izuku would just grow more and more powerful by the second. It's almost like he has ultra ego. But unfortunately for Bakugo, this would lead Izuku to getting more powerful than Katsuki, and Izuku would take the win, ultimately catching a dub in the entire UA Festival arc. Now we have the Hero Killer arc. And because events have changed so much up to this point, this arc will be completely unrecognizable. During this arc, because Izuku doesn't have the ability of One for All this time around, All Might doesn't influence Izuku's decision. And due to the fact that Izuku was the one that won, had a rage quirk, he ended up attracting the attention of one of the top 10 heroes in My Hero Academia, Mirako. Because he ended up attracting her attention, he goes there, meaning that he is unfortunately not available when Ida ends up getting killed by the Hero Killer Stain. Now, we have no reason to assume that he wouldn't finish Ida off due to the fact that he already feels very vengeful, and so Stain would ultimately end up destroying Ida, leading a very, very bad thing to happen for UA. They end up closing for 2 months due to the public scrutiny, and because they end up undergoing so much public fire, and so they're pretty much forced to shut down. However, eventually they end up covering the press enough, and Ida's family ends up saying that they don't want this to happen, considering that it was Ida's choice, and all of this ends up leading them to reopen. However, this time around they reopened with the dorms in place early, and now we're able to jump into the final exams. For this specific video, I'm pretty sure none of you guys came to see what Izuku's test scores are, so we're going to be skipping that completely and straight up just jumping into who Izuku's going to have to face off against. Once again, I spun a wheel, and unfortunately Izuku was paired up against the worst possible choice, Aizawa, with his erasure quirk. And his teammate ended up being Momo Yaoyorozu. This leads Izuku to end up catching an L due to the fact that he does become a bit over reliant on his quirk, and even Momo couldn't help because his personality this time around doesn't lead him to encourage Momo. Instead, he just tells her to pretty much like help him, and ultimately with him trying his absolute hardest, even with some gadgets that Momo would create, I ultimately think that Aizawa would definitely be able to get the best of Izuku and Momo, and this would lead both of them to have to undergo extra courses during the forest training arc. This time around, Deku would end up having to take the extra step courses and would be very, very not happy. And this time around, he doesn't care about Koda at all like he does in the original, until inevitably he would end up saving Koda from a very, very big fall, and eventually he would end up asking Mandalay what's up with this kid, why is he so angry? She ends up telling Izuku his backstory, and ultimately Izuku develops some sort of semblance of care for Koda. So the day that the villains would attack Izuku, noticing that Koda went off, he would pretty much follow Koda and not exactly wanting to talk to him, he kind of just sits behind a rock and listens to Koda pout and talk about how much he misses his parents, when ultimately a villain would arrive, being Muscular of course, and with Izuku's brand new abilities he would be able to keep up with Muscular so much easier than he does in canon. I mean, Muscular gets completely obliterated by like a 50% one for all Izuku in the anime, so I think that a rageful Quirk Deku, who overhears the fact that this is the guy that literally killed Koda's parents, is more than enough to provide Izuku with just enough rage to be able to overpower Muscular and send him flying off of this mountain. Does he die? I'd rather not answer that question. But after this, Izuku would make his way towards Aizawa to give Koda towards him, and eventually he would make his way into the forest, where he would realize that Bakugo was one of the targets, obviously due to Muscular, and he would go off to try to find him. However, he would be too little too late, and so, in a last-ditch effort to try to save Bakugo from these villains, he would jump into the portal with him. However, this would only lead the villains to use Bakugo as leverage, telling him that if he doesn't sit down quietly, they'll kill Bakugo. And so with that leverage, they would manage to cause Izuku not to be able to retaliate towards them and ultimately restrain him as well as Bakugo, eventually trying to convince them to become villains, but ultimately they would fail. Bakugo's conviction to become a hero is way too powerful, and Izuku would tell them that they can go suck on it if they think that he'll ever turn to the dark side. They would go on a laugh, and Shigaraki would even place a couple of fingers on Deku, making him very, very angry. And I definitely can see the villains being like, and pretty much holding a flame towards the face of Bakugo, telling him that if he acts up, they'll kill him. And so Izuku has to calm himself down very quickly and is unable to use his incredible abilities to pretty much break them out and destroy them each individually, due to the fact that they have the high ground in this situation. And so he would be forced to simply sit there and have to deal with these villains until eventually the hideout raid arc would happen. Eventually, All Might and the heroes would end up arriving, and they would be able to let Deku use his quirk to break free, and he would eventually end up watching as all of the villains would be taken away by All For One, and he would make his grand entrance. Izuku and Bakugo would both be in the midst of this, and eventually, Izuku and Bakugo would refuse to leave, saying that it's their fault that All Might's even in this position, and Izuku would say that they need to help out in any way that they can. But Bakugo ultimately would say that he knows that if he was to stick around, he'd probably just get in the way as things are now. He would go on a turn towards Izuku and say, "Hey Deku, kill this guy for me, right?" And Deku would look at him, dap him up and say, "I got you." As from here, Bakugo would make his way out of this area, and eventually what would end up going down is that Izuku and All Might would both stare down at All For One, as he would go on to tell things to All Might. And as Izuku watches All For One pretty much toy with All Might, he would get angrier and angrier. Realizing that All For One has all these quirks and isn't fighting him quote unquote like a man would lead Izuku to get more and more rageful by the second, and eventually the angrier that Izuku would get, the easier it would be to keep up with All Might and All For One. And through the use of teamwork, they would both be able to destroy All For One by using Deku's ability to get stronger the angrier he gets, which would eventually lead them to being able to defeat him, and All Might wouldn't even have to reveal his Small Might form. However, he would be forced to retire due to the fact that his last little bit of One For All was all used up. And now we get a little bit of a boring arc, the Provisional Hero License arc, which really doesn't change at all, and the stakes are basically zero. So Deku essentially just overperforms to his canonical counterpart and eventually passes very easily. Oh, and might I add, Bakugo passes as well. But now we have the Overhaul arc, which is actually going to be a little interesting because it does change a lot. This time around, when the big three students end up entering the class and challenging everybody, Deku and Bakugo would both be present, and they would not only go on to put an incredible fight up against Mirio, but they would defeat him, putting up the best tag team action they could have ever performed due to the fact that they've been training together all their lives. And when Bakugo would get hit, Deku would come in and attack, and when Deku would get hit, it would just make him angrier and angrier. And using their tag team combos that are completely unpredictable, they would be able to land attacks on even Mirio himself, using the speed of Bakugo with his explosions and the raw strength of Izuku, and his speed combined with the fact that he's getting angrier and angrier. barrier every time that Mirio lands an attack on him. The second he gets gut punched by Mirio, Izuku's rage would overflow and his aura would cause it to pretty much go crazy, kind of like a Super Saiyan aura, leading Izuku to use his rage going crazy, and he would go on to land attack after attack after attack after attack on Mirio, who, might I add, is the user of One For All this time around because All Might didn't give it to Deku. And so he would defeat a Mirio who has full access to 30% of One For All, which is completely insane. And because of this, Mirio would end up offering both Bakugo and Izuku a chance to go to his agency. They both decide that they pretty much have nothing to lose, and so they end up agreeing, deciding that Mirio's a pretty cool guy. Because of this, they end up encountering Eri just like in the original. However, this time around, we have the combination of 3 insanely powerful students. And even though Mirio in his gut, it's telling him don't approach, don't face off against Overhaul, he knows that these 3 are more than capable of defeating him. And so they would blitz at Overhaul, mainly Mirio would, and using his phasing quirk, he would go on a phase through Overhaul's hand and land a powerful blow to the stomach of Overhaul, sending him flying, leading Bakugo to shoot an explosion square in Overhaul's face, and Izuku to use his energy whip tendrils to hold him up into the air, leading an unconscious Overhaul not to be able to do a thing, and Eri's eyes to be wide open as she realizes that these guys are incredible. She would then be taken in by UA themselves, and this would eventually lead us to another UA school festival. The one in which they perform an incredible masterpiece for the crowd to all watch, especially Eri. And I'm pretty sure you guys are probably thinking to yourself, alright, what happens to Gentle this time? Well, to put it simply, he gets stomped by Deku, who completely forgets the stuff just like in canon, and it would eventually lead us to the joint training arc. However, once Izuku watches Bakugo completely obliterate his own section, he would decide that what he wants to do is pull off an insane 1v5 clip. I mean, we saw Bakugo in the anime himself completely obliterate the team of 4 people that he faced off against. And Izuku, deciding that he wants to do better than Bakugo, would go on ahead and try his absolute best, going on to hit an insane 1v5 clip in which he goes on to embarrass the entirety of Class 1B as well as Shinso. And then this would lead us to the My Villain Academia arc, in which we really won't be covering ourselves just due to the fact that that doesn't have anything to do with Izuku. However, the Endeavor Agency training arc definitely does. However, I don't think we could even call it this, considering the fact that they wouldn't even go with Endeavor. Todoroki would. However, Deku and Bakugo would end up going with Mirko, and they would get stronger, essentially just consisting of them training and not overly relying on their quirks, pretty much just training their own physical bodies, leading them to get even more powerful than they would be in the original. And this would lead us to our final arc, the Paranormal Liberation War, in which this time around, you would probably be thinking to yourself, oh wow, I can't wait for this. Things are really gonna change. Yeah, they do change. Because this time around, when the war is going down, it all basically goes down just like in canon. However, when Izuku is facing off against a full-powered Shigaraki, it is getting insane. Deku would start this entire battle off by beginning to get completely mollywopped. Mirio would be in the battlefield as well, and he would be doing his absolute best to hold off Shigaraki. Shigaraki would be doing his absolute craziest job to go insane, and they would be defeating him. However, eventually, just like in anime fashion, we would see Shigaraki take a foothold in this battle, and he would begin to push back, ultimately shooting a full-powered black, darkness tendril straight at Bakugo, causing Bakugo to jump in the way of Deku to pretty much try to avoid it. I know I said it was going at Bakugo, but this is what I really meant, right? And when it impales Bakugo, Deku would almost feel like time stopped. He would see his friend that he's known his whole life pretty much think that he just got killed, and this would set Deku off. His entire body and everything around him would go silent, and Deku would let out a gut-wrenching heavenly yell, as from here his entire body would be coated with a massive aura that would send Mirio and Shigaraki flying back, and Izuku would speed blitz Shigaraki, grabbing him by the neck and pretty much smashing him into the earth, creating a crater so massive it might as well be equivalent to that of the Grand Canyon, and he would begin to pummel down on Shigaraki's face until he would literally have a face that is unrecognizable. And then he throws him up into the sky and shoots a full-powered energy rage mouth beam at Shigaraki, in which he deploys all of the rage that he has in his heart in this one move, and it would obliterate Shigaraki. Mirio watching this in complete awe, and the battlefield being completely engulfed in a red aura, so incredibly massive that nothing would be left behind. And yeah, ladies and gentlemen, that would pretty much conclude what if Deku had a rage quirk. And if you guys have made it this far into the video, you know what I'm about to ask. Go ahead and slap a like on this video and subscribe, seeing as your boy is trying to hit that 100K and be able to shove that plaque in everyone's faces. But no, seriously, let me know any comments and questions that you have about the what if specifically down below, and go on ahead and comment your suggestions that I might be able to consider. That being said though, ladies and gentlemen, that has been it for me today. Have a wonderful day, and as always, remember, God loves you, and Xehther out. Peace.